Okay, so when we left off, we'd gotten to the point where Darwin was trying to put together all of these pieces. And he comes up with this idea of small incremental changes that lead to species adapting to their environment. Now, I've actually messed up the timeline here, so we need to go back a little bit and talk about what Darwin does when he gets back to England. His father gives him a house because, of course, he was very wealthy, and he decides to do more research. And one of the things he does is he decides that while he has been conversing with many scientists, he is not accepted as a natural historian, as a scientist by the scientific community. And so he really wants to be respected because he's starting to get the idea that his theory is going to shake things up a bit. And it's going to make a lot of people uncomfortable because if you've been taught that things are the way they are because that's the way God made them, and here Darwin comes up with a whole explanation that doesn't require God to actually do anything, then a lot of people are going to be upset about that. And so Darwin went to one of the curators at the British Museum and said, give me a project. And so the guy gave him barnacles, this huge collection of barnacles that had been collected from all over the world. Barnacles are these little arthropod species. They're actually closely related to spiders and insects and crabs. And they make these little structures, and the structure sticks to a surface, and then the arthropod sticks its legs out of the hole and catches food, usually just bits of organic matter floating in the water. And so somebody needed to catalog and identify all of these barnacles, figure out which ones had been identified and which hadn't. And so Darwin took that on. He thought, all right, this will take a year or two. And it took 8 years. He essentially gave himself a PhD project and spent 8 years doing a PhD, is what we would now consider this. Meanwhile, he was also conducting a bunch of experiments to test out his ideas. And among my favorite stories, he had a butler, and he had his butler help him with these experiments. And so one of the things he wanted to test was how would species get, for example, from South America to the Galapagos Islands? And if they like floated on the water, how long could they survive? And would seeds, for example, still be viable if they had floated across the ocean? And so he had his butler fill a bathtub with salt water and put a bunch of seeds in it, and they left them for various periods of time and then planted them to see what would grow. And so he spent, it turns out, 20 years. And he didn't publish. And long before this 20 years is over, he has enough data, he has enough information, he has enough evidence that natural selection is a force, and perhaps the primary force for how evolution works. And he doesn't want to publish because he knows it's going to upset a lot of people, and one of those people is his wife. So here's the theory all put together. Natural variation is something that we see within populations, and that means that not all the individuals of any given species are exactly the same. They may be subtly different, but individuals are different, just like these two capybaras aren't exactly the same size or color. These barnacles aren't exactly the same size. Their openings aren't exactly the same shape. They've attached to slightly different areas on these rocks. One is solitary, the others are stuck to each other. And these small differences can affect whether an organism survives or thrives in a given environment. The other thing he knew was that natural variation within populations can be passed on to offspring. So even though individual people aren't all exactly the same, yes, that's me with my parents and my daughters, The traits that parents have get passed on to their offspring. So you can see that I look just like my mom, and my daughters look just like me. And the other thing, and this is key, and this he actually got from another scientist, but all organisms, excuse me, it didn't come out very well, all organisms produce more offspring than the environment can support. One example of this, you've heard the phrase reproduce like rabbits. Rabbits actually do reproduce at an incredibly fast rate. They can have up to 14 offspring per litter. They usually have, I think, about 5 or 6. But they can reproduce every single month. And so before long, you can end up with more rabbits than the environment can provide food for, which means that not all individuals are going to survive to reproduce. And that's part of why organisms produce more offspring. Because if all your offspring aren't going to survive to reproduce, then having lots of them essentially gives a better chance that one of your offspring will survive to reproduce. And so, because not every individual gets to survive or gets to reproduce, the individuals that do survive and reproduce are going to be those that are best fitted to the environment. And this is where we come up with the term fitness. So here we have natural variation within populations. Not all organisms are the same. A population is just a group of the same species in a given space. Heritability of traits. Parents can pass their traits to their offspring. And then overproduction of offspring. Everybody makes too many, which means that some aren't going to live. Not everyone is going to reproduce. Which means that the individuals that are able to survive and reproduce will pass on their genes to the next generation. And that next generation is going to have more of the traits that enabled individuals to reproduce in that given environment. Now, if the environment changes, those might not be the best traits anymore. But in the environment that that organism was living in, the next generation is going to have the traits of the individuals that were able to reproduce. All right, so Darwin was famous for keeping notebooks, very detailed notebooks of all of his experiments and observations. And this is one of his first drawings, laying out his idea for how this change happens. So he wrote, I think, and then he wrote this tree. And what we have is, this is the first individual here. And as time goes on, that individual passes on their traits, and then something happens that different traits are preferred or better fitted to different environments. And so perhaps two groups of offspring develop in different directions. And after many, many, many generations, you have these many branching episodes, and you end up with a bunch of organisms that we see today that are related to this original one, but are adapted to the specific environment that they live in. All right, so Darwin is over here in England doing his experiments, writing his works, not getting anything published. Well, getting a few things published, but not his big idea, not his big theory of natural selection. Meanwhile, there's another man, Alfred Russel Wallace. He has a completely different life story. He is not rich. He does not have a father who's going to give him a house. He has to work. And what he decides to do, he wants to be an adventurer. And he decides that he would sign on to an expedition that was going to South America and collect specimens, scientific specimens, and mail them back to England and sell them to collectors and scientists. And that way he could make enough money. So he did that. He went to South America. He collected a bunch of things. He shipped them back to England. And I'm not making this up. The ship sank, and all of his specimens were lost. It took him several years to get enough money and get another find another expedition that he could join. He ended up not in South America, but in Southeast Asia, in Indonesia. And he is fascinated by Darwin and by the other work by these natural historians that are doing this great research. And meanwhile, he is collecting specimens in Southeast Asia and shipping them back in many different shipments so that they don't all get lost. And what he's seeing is that there are many individuals of the same species. Like he'd select a bunch of some type of bird because their feathers are very valuable. And he would find that some are large and some are small, and some of their feathers are redder and some they're yellower. And he starts to think, I wonder why this is. So he writes a letter to the foremost thinker of the day, who he thinks would be interested, to get some feedback. What do you think about this? And he wrote to Charles Darwin. And he said, hey, here's how I think evolution works. And it was a fairly long letter describing what he had found and the evidence that he had found. And it was exactly Darwin's theory of natural selection. So Darwin said, oh, crap, what do I do now? And so he went to his friends and he said, what do we do? His friend said, we've told you, you should have published earlier. He's like, I know, but now this guy, Alfred Russel Wallace, has come up with the same thing. Had Wallace sent the letter to literally anyone else, that person would have read this letter to the Linnaean Society, and Wallace would be the originator of the theory of evolution by natural selection. Instead, he sent it to Darwin, who had been working on this question for 20 years. And Darwin and his friends said, let's read both of your papers together. Quick, Darwin, write something. So Darwin pulled together a short paper. Those were both read together at the Linnaean Society of London in 1858. After that, there was actually not as much response as you might expect. It wasn't a big explosion of, wow, that's amazing, we figured it out, or wow, that's horrible, no, you can't say that. It was just kind of like, oh, that's interesting. But Darwin knew that other people were working on the same question, and so he spent the next year pulling together his papers and writing what we now call The Origin of Species. The full title is On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. This is a link to the full text. He's an excellent writer. You can read it. It's a wonderful read. Here's the problem. Just like today, when people don't read the headlines and they just, click on something and go like, oh, yeah, that headline, and then, get mad at the headline or, pass it on to their friends without actually reading the article. Yeah, nobody did that either. So most people didn't really care about this whole theory of natural selection. All they saw was favored races. Now, what Darwin meant was that groups of organisms were favored by nature because they were better able to survive and reproduce. What the English people read was that, white people are rich and powerful, and the English have the largest empire in the world because we have been favored by nature. This theory that the white race is better than the other races of humans is not based in biology, and it's totally racist, and the idea that this is somehow biologically correct is called social Darwinism. And that means that the rich get to do whatever they want because they are favored, and they are favored, obviously, because they are rich. Okay, that's crap. And that's not what natural selection means. Natural selection only refers to survival and reproduction. That's all, okay? If you think that you are better than other people because of the color of your skin, you're just an asshole, okay? That's not biological, and biology doesn't agree with you, okay? That's not what the favored races thing means, okay? So let it go. Also, there's no such thing as races in humans, okay? We just have different skin colors. There's nothing else different about us. We're very, very similar, Really, we really are. Just racism and race was created by white people. The English first, and they passed it on to us. Anyway, so Darwin writes The Origin of Species. First printing sells out immediately. They do a second printing. And people start talking about it. And as you can imagine, religious people are very upset by this because suddenly there isn't the role for God that we saw. But not all religious people are upset by this. And in fact, some ministers said, how much more amazing is it that God created these organisms that can then fit themselves to the environment? Like he made things that could not just be one way, regardless of what happened on the earth, but could change themselves. Which is kind of a cool way of thinking of it. I mean, they don't change themselves, but they get changed by the environment. But, still, it's a nice thought. Anyway, so if Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection is correct, then just as with all theories, we should be able to test it. We should be able to see evidence of it. We should be able to see evidence of it having worked that way in the past. And we should be able to test it happening in the future. Spoiler, all of that has happened. And in fact, we've been testing this theory of evolution by natural selection for more than 150 years, and there has been no better explanation given, no better scientific explanation given for how species change, where they come from, and how they develop. We should see evidence that species that lived in the past are different from species that are alive today. We do see that with all organisms, including with humans. We see that humans have gotten taller as more nutrients have been available in the last few thousand years. We see that the ability to break down lactose as an adult is a trait that has spread among human populations. And I'll show you a map. We can actually watch that spread happen. We should be able to see natural selection happening in nature. And honestly, most of the time, nature is working really slowly. And remember that this has to happen over generations. So we can't really see much happening in humans because human generations are so long. They're 20 years. And so humans only see a few generations of our own species. What we can see many, many generations of are bacteria. Bacteria can reproduce in 20 minutes. We can see evolution in bacteria in a matter of days. And I'll show you a video of that. We should be able to see species change over time, especially when there's a change in the environment, and we can and we do see that. And organisms that evolved from a common ancestor should have similar traits, and we do see that. One thing we see is that in all land vertebrate animals, all animals that have a backbone, humans, all other mammals, all lizards, birds, turtles, amphibians, every single one, same backbone, same basic setup of bones in the limbs. And I'll show you some more of that in a minute. So we can watch natural selection happen. And this is an example. I'm going to post this on Canvas, but here's the link to this. This is an experiment that was done showing bacteria evolving antibiotic resistance as the result of new mutations occurring. Yes, mutations, new mutations in the DNA of bacteria as they reproduce. New mutations enabling the bacteria to survive in environments that had been toxic to their predecessors. Other evidence for evolution, we see fossils of things that aren't around anymore. Like this is a femur of a dinosaur. That's a really, really big femur. We see footprints of dinosaurs left 120 million years ago. We see trees that have been turned into rocks because they fell into, say, the bottom of a lake where there wasn't oxygen and they were covered by soil, and the minerals penetrated the cells of the dead tree, replaced all the organic material with minerals, solidified into a tree-shaped rock. Darwin also predicted that there should be transitional fossils. And this was a problem at the time because there were some very old fossils and some younger fossils that showed new traits, and there were gaps in time and gaps in development in the middle. And what Darwin said was that if we at some point have a fish and then later we have a fish-like thing with legs, that somewhere in between we're going to see the development of those legs. And we do. And we see the development of bigger, stronger fins on the fish that develop into forelimbs, that develop into arms, and the hind limbs that start to develop into legs until you have a four-legged organism that can live on land. So I want to draw your attention to this one, Tiktaalik. Tiktaalik rosier was discovered by Niels Schuben. That's him. That's me back A, when I didn't color my hair pink, and B, when people were allowed to go places. And he found this Tiktaalik rosier fossil in rock, I think it's 215 million years. Oh, that may be wrong about that. Anyway, he was looking for rock of a specific age, between these two ages. They looked, it turned out to be up above way up in Canada, in what used to be an ocean, and on the edge of what used to be that ocean, they found this Tiktaalik skeleton. This is an artist's rendering of what Tiktaalik would have looked like. I love that they gave it like this little smile. It's so cute. And you can go to this website and look at the characteristics that Tiktaalik has that are like a fish, but you can also see characteristics that it had that are like amphibians and lizards, because Tiktaalik is a transition between fish living entirely in the water and organisms living on land. That is the transitional fossil. We also see transitional fossils between chimpanzees and humans. This is Ardipithecus ramidus, I could say that, lived about 4.4 million years ago, a direct ancestor of modern humans, but very closely related to chimpanzees, and shared a common ancestor with chimpanzees. We see that the pelvis is more upright, as we see in a human, but we see that the toes are much longer, and the big toe can sit laterally for grasping branches. So yes, chimpanzees and lots of monkeys and apes do have an opposable big toe. So before you get too excited about your opposable thumb, you do not have an opposable big toe. So when we see the chimpanzee skeleton, this is a modern chimpanzee skeleton, this is a modern human skeleton, we see that Ardipithecus has some characteristics like humans, like this upright pelvis, and the feet where you can walk on the bottoms, but also the very, very long arms and the separated forearm bones that we see in the chimpanzees who walk around on their knuckles, the much longer fingers that we see in chimpanzees, the smaller brain case and larger jaw than on the modern human. So this is an ancestor of humans that shares a common ancestor with modern chimpanzees. All right, so we're going to stop there, and we're going to talk about some more homologies, or shared traits, and synapomorphies, or traits that look similar but are not because of a common ancestor. They're because of convergent evolution.